Okay, good morning, everyone. You're all very welcome to the session this morning, part of the Foresight webinar series looking at the industrial strategy and next steps following its publication. I'm just going to give delegates just another couple of moments to join. I know we've just passed 10, so we're right on time, but just going to let any latecomers join before we get started with the session this morning. Okay, then I think we've got a good number, so I think we'll make a start. So once again, good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's session. As I mentioned there, we're here to discuss the UK's new 10-year industrial strategy, with a particular focus this morning on what it means for industrial manufacturing competitiveness, industrial electrification, and also the broader industrial decarbonisation agenda as well. I think it's fair to say that this strategy has been long awaited. Now it's here. It feels like a genuine statement of direction, especially for our foundation and pioneer kind of IS8 industries, taken alongside other recent policy developments as well. I think we're seeing a real the contours of a very supportive landscape for manufacturers and energy intensive businesses across the UK. The very strong turnout this morning. I can already see over 50 people joined. I think that reflects just how important it is to make success of this strategy, not just in implementation now, but also next steps following its publication for policy as well, and shaping the next phase of delivery too. I know we have a number of policy colleagues as well who joined us today, so it's fantastic to see you too, and thank you for being part of the conversation. We're also joined by three fantastic speakers this morning. I'll introduce them now in turn, and then they'll each have about 10 minutes or so to deliver some opening remarks before we open up to questions and comments from the floor as well. So please do feel free to use that Q&A function that you should see at the top of your screen to ask questions. Feel free to pop them in throughout the session as speakers are presenting their opening remarks, and we'll bank them all for the end as well. And I'll endeavour to get through as many of them as possible. So yeah, feel free to pop them in as and when they come to you. First up, we have Patrick Matthewson, Senior Policy Manager for Net Zero at Make UK. Next, we'll hear from Michael Lord, Senior Industrial Decarbonisation Analyst at the Climate Change Committee. And then we're going to finish with Rachel Cary, Head of Industrial Strategy at Energy UK. And I can see Rachel's on the call now. Rachel's come straight from another session this morning looking at data centres. So Rachel, thanks very much for being here and wearing two caps this morning as well. Great to have you. Real pleasure to welcome all three of you, and also Patrick and Michael. Some of you may remember them from our Net Zero Live conference last month, where we discussed the growing role of electrification in industry as a pathway to decarbonisation as well. So looking forward to seeing how your views have changed, or perhaps not so much as well, following publication of the strategy. So without further delay, I'm going to hand over now to Patrick. First up, the floor is yours. Please feel free to start your opening remarks.
No worries. Cheers, Sharon. Yeah, and great to be here. Obviously really delighted to be speaking about industrial strategies, as it's been a long time coming. Just a little bit about Make UK. We're a trade association representing manufacturers across the country. And obviously this is quite a big moment for us. We've been campaigning for an industrial strategy over, the last sort of 10 years. So it's really great to see this finally come into fruition. And I think generally, as a sort of headline for this, we're overall really happy with it as a first step. But I think we acknowledge that this is very much a beginning of a much longer journey now, and we need to make the next 10 years a success. And that all comes down to being able to implement everything that's on paper as efficiently, as effectively as possible, and making sure that it fits the needs of many of the industrial sectors that have been highlighted, and also meets the needs of wider manufacturing, which we believe it has the foundations to do so. But again, it's all in that implementation. So I'm going to focus on a few areas because I'm aware that this is focusing on electrification and the growth angle. So firstly, you may have seen that Make UK were campaigning quite a lot on the need to reduce industrial energy prices, and I think that's probably a theme that will filter through every speaker's spiel today. I know that the CCC were very firm on it as well, and Energy UK have also been leading the charge. So I think it's been a well understood need to address industrial energy prices. For instance, in our 2025 executive survey, there were 51% of our membership who highlighted it as a primary concern for their business operations and one of our highest costs. And ultimately, it's been holding back our competitiveness as a sector. I think our industrial energy prices have been around 4 times higher than US and European competitors, which has really put a stop on being able to take further steps towards net zero and being able to take further steps towards electrification. So the two kind of key announcements on this was an extension to the British industry supercharger, which is obviously a massive win for energy intensive users, but also the introduction of a British industrial competitiveness scheme. And this scheme was aiming to reduce energy prices by 25% through removal of policy costs for around 7,000 manufacturers that have been classed as sort of higher emitters. And the plan is, I think, to begin that in 2027. Our view on that is it's obviously very much in line with the sort of recommendations we were making. However, we do have some concerns, particularly over the timeline. So 2027 is obviously quite a large gap from now onwards, and we can't see that there's a huge amount of reason to slow this process down. We're sort of quite aware that the mechanism shouldn't be that different from what's being done with the supercharger, should be fairly well understood and should be able to be implemented much quicker, so we can start feeling those benefits much sooner. We would also want that scope to be extended. Obviously, we're representing a much wider subsection of manufacturing, and we'd love to see the majority of our membership included in that. And further to that, the government has obviously highlighted a 25% reduction. I think there's still some uncertainty around where those figures are coming from, but also whether that reduction is actually competitive enough, or whether it brings us closer, but not really in the realms of being more competitive than European competitors. I think the proposed reduction doesn't necessarily bring us cheaper than, say, Germany, and definitely doesn't bring us cheaper than places like China, who are sort of taking a bit of a lead, particularly in manufacturing sort of clean technologies and moving ahead with this sort of green growth agenda. So a lot of it is still up in the air, I think, and a lot of it still requires some interrogation. There's a consultation period due to begin. Dates are still a little bit uncertain on that, but we'll obviously be pushing for those sort of 3 key areas, and trying to make sure that government takes into consideration whether there's anything more that can be done, and whether it's reaching enough people to make sure that the gains that could be given through greater growth are achieved. Further, I think beyond that, we also need to think about what the long-term solution for bringing down industrial energy prices is. I don't think that a sort of discount scheme can be sustainable in the long term. I don't think many governments think in that way. So it'll be interesting to see whether there's much more long-term thinking beyond sort of making decisions within the review of electricity market arrangements and sort of driving a renewables-led system, or whether there's any more long-term thinking on how industrial energy prices can be reduced even further and to get us further in line with more competitive nations. But yeah, ultimately on that side, a really good first step, but we need more detail. We need to keep working with government to make sure that it's fitting our membership. Further away from that, just thinking about electrification and thinking about what more can be done around sort of the energy points. I think the industrial strategy feels quite light on electrification and demand reduction and energy efficiency measures. There's obviously an appetite to extend grid connections and improve the process for planning and improve the process for enabling those grid connections. But there's not much in terms of direct support for electrification, and there's not much direct support for those sort of efficiency measures that can drive a lot of the drive that we need to achieve net zero. I think what's particularly worrying from our point of view is that the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund has been removed, and there's not much evidence from government on whether there will be a successor scheme to this. We would strongly encourage government to consider some sort of electrification measure where businesses could get, some sort of funding towards that greater electrification push. So we believe that's really essential for the industry to reach net zero and to reach our wider net zero goals, which I'm aware that the CCC have put out quite a lot on that, and I imagine we'll talk much further to that point. So I think, yeah, grid connections is a great first step, and it's something that comes up a lot from our membership. They're desperate to be able to interact with that grid more efficiently and more effectively. The planning process has been taking far too long for them to gain power to their operations. But again, there needs to be a longer term vision on how we're going to encourage electrification and how we are going to encourage efficiency reductions. And then further, just on two wider points of kind of make UK priorities, but I think they do also play into the drive for industrial growth and electrification. So on skills, we're pleased to see that there's been some effort to put some more funding into the area, but we need to see some more ring fencing of things like the apprenticeship levy. Particularly with skills, it's going to be especially important as we need new technologies, and we're driving towards bringing CCUS onto the system and using more hydrogen in the system. That will require skilled engineers. That will require people with the knowledge to be able to do that. And the government really needs to be considering what that pipeline looks like over the next 5-10 years and making sure that we're getting the right people in the right areas of the country. As you might be aware, manufacturing obviously has a lot of regionality and a lot of different places across the country. And that often can make it harder to get the right skills pipeline into the right places. So there really needs to be a big consideration of how that will work. Aware that the government has launched a sort of clean energy skills task force. Again, light on the detail with that. So it's very difficult to comment at this point whether that will be a success, but it's the right sort of thinking, and I think it will become a really important part of how we reach the next step of getting towards net zero. And finally, just also want to highlight access to finance. This is another area that comes out from our membership quite a lot. So we're really pleased to see that there's been an additional 7 billion put towards the British industry bank. But again, this could go further. And again, we need to see how that really plays out and whether that is sufficient enough to drive the innovation that the sector is ready to do. And I think that's the kind of thing that's underpinning all of this. It's really great to see a long-term strategic vision, but we need to ensure that it actually meets the needs of manufacturing, because from all our surveys, we're seeing them willing to move fast and willing to innovate within this environment, but they need the carrot, as it were, to bring them along with them. And I think previously we've not been good at providing that carrot. It's been more of a sort of stick and more of a sort of rising costs to make it more difficult to run a high carbon operation. I think now we need to think about how we can incentivize that further step to electrification and that further step to driving a net zero economy. But yeah, overall good first step, but the detail is where it's going to get interesting.
Patrick, thank you very much indeed for that great start to the discussions this morning. I'll just remind delegates, please do pop your questions into the Q&A there. I'm sure that was more than enough to stimulate some discussion, and we'll keep them ready to ask the speakers once everyone has presented. So Patrick, thanks again. Michael, I'll introduce you now and hand over to yourself.
Thanks, Tin, and I've just got some slides to share if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, just 3 slides. So yeah, hello everyone. I'm Michael Lord. I'm Senior Industry Analyst at the Climate Change Committee. A lot of you probably got an idea of what the Climate Change Committee is, but we are an independent advisor to government on climate change, reducing emissions and adapting to climate change, set up by the Climate Change Act in 2008. And a big thing we do is provide advice on the 5-year carbon budgets that lead up to net zero. And we released the latest one of those earlier this year. And this is our pathway for industrial decarbonisation, contributing to net zero. So these are in the top dotted line is industry emissions. If we did nothing in terms of decarbonisation, just carried on as it is, they would slightly rise due to increased output according to the baseline that we assumed. The bottom purple line is the way we have assessed the least cost pathway of industrial decarb towards net zero, and all the coloured wedges are the methods of decarbonisation. So a lot of our analysis is kind of about how much each of those methods contributes to the decarbonisation. So the methods being types of efficiency, carbon capture and storage, and then fuel switching. And there was a big change in this report. We do these reports every 5 years. There was quite a big change compared to previous ones in that there was a lot more electrification. So that's that orange section than there has been in previous years. And that's really to do with the development of certain electrical technologies like heat pumps having higher capacities, the possibility of electric steam crackers, for example, in the chemical sector, and the glass sector moving largely to electrification. These kind of technologies have moved on just in the last 5 years. So we saw them as having much more potential. And I think this is the way thinking has gone generally in government and in industry. Stakeholders, I would say, were overwhelmingly supportive of a pathway which prioritised electrification, with the caveat that these pathways that we do, they're least cost pathways to achieve net zero. They're not in any way a prediction, and in fact, we try and make clear where additional policies are needed to actually achieve this pathway. So at the moment, this amount of electrification based on current policies or the policies that as they were in February is not actually likely to happen. So we're clear on that. And in that context, the industrial strategy was definitely a step forward. So I'd agree with Patrick and Make UK on that. The industrial strategy didn't go into detail. It focused on what the government sees as the growth areas and not the high emitting areas of like steel, chemicals, cement, glass, paper, that kind of thing. And we didn't expect it to really. We expect that to be in the industrial decarbonisation strategy, which is planned for next year. But to the extent that it did address those sectors through the electricity price measures that Patrick mentioned, I think we were pretty pleased with it, actually. It was more than I personally expected to have what I see as a British industry supercharger light kind of policy extended to potentially 7,000 companies. I agree with Make UK that waiting until 2027 to implement this seems like too long. The framework appears already to be there, so why not do it sooner? But it is definitely a step forward. And in terms of decarbonisation, we're probably most interested in the ratio of that electricity price to gas price. And I think a kind of back of the envelope calculation would say that these measures will bring that ratio down from about 4 today to about 3. So electricity will be still 3 times more expensive than gas, which is probably the absolute minimum you need to start getting things like heat pumps installed. Since we produced the carbon budget, so the other major report we do every year on climate mitigation is our progress report. So that came out just a few weeks ago. So the progress report is really where we highlight our assessment of how the government is doing against its own pathway to net zero and whether the policies are there to meet that. Industry this year, as in most recent years, is one of the worst areas in terms of decarbonisation. About half of the emissions that the government has said that it will reduce. So the graph shows the six carbon budget. So let's say that's 2035. So in the next 10 years, about half of them are yellow or green, which means there's credible plans or there's some risks. And most of that area, so the better half of it is, for example, CCS policies, hydrogen, and the big decarbonisation of Port Talbot, to which the government has paid, Port Talbot Steelworks, to which the government has paid 500 million. The areas at risk are electrification, resource efficiency, on which remains almost no policy, and the other area is non-road mobile machinery, which is we count as part of industry, maybe of less interest to this group. So electrification, we see it as a central element in decarbonisation, but we highlight that we're very far from having enough policy on it. And so since we did this assessment, the industrial strategy has, started to fill that hole. And I suppose what we really hope is that this chart will look a lot more green once we've had the industrial decarbonisation strategy next year, and also supporting strategies like the steel strategy and the circular economy strategy for England. All of those are due out in the next year. So my last slide is just, I presented this at the conference Tiernan mentioned, actually. It's our recommendations for government action on industrial decarbonisation. And you could obviously have a very long list of these. We've got a very long list of them, but just the top 5. And the first one was to make electricity cheaper to gas and international competitors. So I think the government's absolutely right to have focused on that in its industrial strategy, and for the policy to have been to remove, they haven't removed all of the policy costs, but to remove a lot of the policy costs from those industry bills. So that, that I presented this about 3 weeks ago, and that's happened since then, and that's great. But it's probably not going to be enough. We care about decarbonisation. It's probably not going to be enough for large-scale switching of gas burning in manufacturing to electrification. And for that, we're going to need some other kind of financial incentive. And that's probably not going to be, just lowering the costs for thousands of manufacturers in the same way as in the industry supercharger and the competitiveness scheme. It's going to be something where there's some requirement on behalf of the manufacturers to electrify a fossil fuel power process, and that they get some sort of government incentive to do that. So there are business models for this in carbon capture and storage and hydrogen to incentivize it there, but there's nothing so far in electrification. And possibly we've even got backwards, as Patrick mentioned. The Industrial Energy Transformation Fund seems to have disappeared for now. So the support that was there has gone. So that is the big gap that we're looking to be filled as soon as possible. Our second recommendation was to speed up the grid connection process. So these two first things are what stakeholders told us were the big things that needed to be addressed. And again, the industrial strategy does address that. I guess it remains to be seen how much the measures will actually speed up the grid connection process. So they've introduced a new service for important connection upgrades, and also flag changes to the planning and infrastructure powers, so they can speed up this process. But it's going to take more than that, and that isn't a replacement for the huge investment that is going to be needed, an anticipatory investment in the distribution grid. So I'd be interested in comments about what people think about the measures that are in the industrial strategy on connections, and what should be done next. We think it should maintain support for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen. That's very good in many ways, if slightly slow, but credit to the government for setting up that support and getting the industry going. A long-standing gap in industrial decarbonisation strategy is action to improve resource efficiency. That, just like with energy efficiency, it makes a lot of sense to just use materials efficiently, but there's very little incentive to do that. So we say every year that this is a big gap. And finally, just a sort of a sentiment thing to provide confidence in the long-term commitment to UK industrial production and decarbonisation. The big challenge the government has got in this sector of decarbonisation is just keeping firms in the country. And to date, there's been mixed messages from government about whether the government even wants to do that. And I think the disappearance of something like the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund is evidence of that. But on the other side, now we have this industrial strategy. So let's very much hope that, as Patrick said, the things flagged in that will be delivered, and that we'll continue to see the kind of gaps that I've mentioned plugged in future strategies. So that's all from me. Thanks for listening.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. Interesting to hear the Industrial Electricity Transformation Fund mentioned twice there. Now, I'd be interested to hear if there's any comments from any of our attendees on that as well, especially those in the manufacturing sector as well. I can see a couple of questions have come through, so once again we'll bank them for after Rachel has presented. So now I'd like to introduce Rachel to the call. Rachel, if you're there, if you want to pop your mic and camera on, and feel free to go ahead whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this session on such an important topic. So I'm Rachel Cary. I'm Head of Industrial Strategy at Energy UK. So I look at how the energy sector can work best with both industry and also the commercial sector to decarbonise. I'm also looking at things like the supply chain for the energy sector and the skills required to enable the transition. So overall, Energy UK really welcome the industrial strategy, not least because clean energy technologies was selected as one of the 8 growth sectors for the economy. And we recognise that, we're creating fantastic jobs all around the country that tend to be well paid and good quality jobs. And also, if done right, I think this transition to a clean power system and a wider clean energy system can provide significant opportunities for investment in the UK supply chain of those technologies. So we welcome the strategy, and we welcome some of the measures on supply chain and skills that should help with that. I think there's still, a huge role for the private sector. Some of the funding in a lot of areas is not going to be enough to shift the dial. So really keen to work with government and industry to maximise the opportunities there. I think, like the other speakers, I don't want to be too repetitive. We were disappointed to see the removal of the IETF and support for decarbonisation, wider decarbonisation, noting the sort of significant opportunity for energy efficiency and use of hydrogen and carbon capture in lots of companies. I think there was wide recognition. We did a policy review with a number of other trade associations across the business space last year. It was kind of recognised that the ITF was flawed, but it was providing funding, and there were challenges around its suitability for SMEs. But to just take it away and not replace it with something, I think is really disappointing. So we're really hoping to see something in the carbon delivery plan later in the autumn, and funding allocated in the budget or future budgets. I think, though, the additional funding given to some of the investors, public sector investors that have been created, such as the National Wealth Fund investing in the Peak Cluster and CCUS last week, shows that maybe funding is available in different forms. So we're keen to explore that as well. But going on to electrification, which is the topic of today's discussion, we really see the two key challenges, as Michael said, being cost and grid connection. So on cost, we did a piece of work looking at policy cost rebalancing, how we could take policy costs off the electricity bill and move them onto the gas bill for commercial and public sectors, but not for industry. This required significant taxation spend, but also revenue from ETS and CBAM. So we welcomed the door opening to that as a policy in the industrial strategy. But as noted, it is only going to apply to energy intensive manufacturers in the 8 leading sectors. So I think there's a question there, one, over who actually it will apply to, two, whether or not they'll actually electrify or just basically need that money to remain viable and in their current operation. And then there's 3, sort of, what about everyone else who's left behind? And I think there's a real issue there of fairness. So we were very keen to see a widespread policy cost rebalancing, and also a new approach, because I think to date, we've had a policy of putting costs on the bill, and there'll be new policy costs coming on as we bring on things like carbon capture, new nuclear and hydrogen. So we need to really have a debate about which costs go into taxation, which costs go onto the bill. I think the hypothecation angle is really important here. I think we need to have carrots and sticks. So we need to both tax, but then use that funding to actually help people decarbonise. So again, welcome that commitment to consider that as a way of paying for the scheme in part. The second way we saw electricity price costs being addressed was the greater use of power purchase agreements. So again, we did a piece of work on this, looking at the role that PPAs could play in providing industry and potentially quite small companies with both a reliable power price and a long-term power price, which would really make things like electrification easier, because they'd be able to build that into their business case. Although there are a lot of barriers to PPAs, not least if the off-taker has a low credit rating, it can be really hard for them to secure favourable terms of a generator. The other big issue is that the CFD price, the price for new renewables, is put onto PPAs. So if they're actually providing a route to market for new generation, our report suggested that policy cost might be taken off PPAs with new generation that wasn't supported by government schemes. So we're really keen to see the industrial strategy commit to looking at this and gather international evidence. We know that schemes exist in France recently, Norway and Spain, that all provide a guarantee to industrial PPAs. So we'll be feeding into that. And then on the grid connection side, I think, as Michael mentioned, there's sort of 2 aspects to this. So there's one in terms of, have we got the network there that we need to connect businesses electrifying? And that really requires anticipatory investment. So we've seen a move to more spatial planning through the regional energy spatial plans and the strategic spatial energy plan. And that will feed through into the price controls that the networks use to plan and build out the networks. But I think we're in a bit of a chicken and egg situation with industrial electrification, because until business knows what support's available for them to electrify, it's very hard for them to know what system they're going to be putting in and when. That makes it very hard to do a bottom-up assessment of where the need is for investment in the networks. I think there was noted that there was commitments to look at strategic demand, how you actually define that, and linking it to very high level strategies like the industrial strategy is challenging. So I think a sort of clear methodology for how you prioritise grid connection is going to be really important. And at the DNO level, where a lot of businesses will be connecting or reinforcing their connections, we know there've been a barrage of issues. The National Infrastructure Commission did a report looking at all the various issues associated with grid connection, including poor service and inconsistent quotes. The government published its response this week, saying they agreed with all the approaches and were taking them on recommendations and were taking them on board. We're also looking to Ofgem's end-to-end review, which will be looking at distribution connection. So that will really need to deliver. If we can keep going and get this right and get both cost and grid connection going, I think that will be useful. But we are also going to need, on top of a general policy cost rebalancing, I think we are going to need that targeted support for really large projects or higher temperature projects. So in our report on policy cost rebalancing, we suggested that you did a mixture of policy cost rebalancing across the board, but you also introduced a targeted scheme to actually help companies electrify. So really hoping that we see something soon on that from government. We see across the waters in Europe a lot of action under the Innovation Fund that I think we could learn from. And then finally, all of this is spread across multiple strategies, multiple government departments. So I think we're really keen to understand who's going to lead on what initiative, both across the Westminster government and devolved authorities, so that we as an industry can really work to actually implement the strategy and make sure these initiatives work. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you very much indeed for that. A great way to finish the remarks there. I'll invite all three of our speakers to come back now, and we'll begin to open up now for questions and comments. I can see quite a few in the chat and the Q&A there. I suppose I'm just going to very quickly take chair's prerogative and start us off with one I have myself. I suppose it's a two-pronged one. First of all, in terms of grid connection, we've seen announcement of a connections accelerator service. I'm interested to see or to hear from our panelists there what that means for grid connection, kind of how that fits into the 10-year infrastructure strategy and reforms around planning as well. What would you like to see from that? Who leads on that, and kind of what I suppose is the best case scenario for a connections accelerator service. And then I suppose just another really quick one for me around financing this as well. Where will the money come from in terms of these cost rebalancing? Would you like to see that come from general taxation, or would you like to see it come from ETS and CBAM, and also how that links to the EU's approach as well? Would that be beneficial in the long run? So a bit of a two-pronged one there. Does anyone want to start us off on that, specifically on the Connections Accelerator service?
I can kick us off. I'll give Rachel a chance to rest her voice. So I guess on the Connections Acceleration Programme, I mean, it all seems very good in theory, but I think you've raised kind of the key question on who actually has responsibility for a lot of this, and it needs to work so much in step with the strategic spatial plans as well that NESO are leading on. And it needs to work so well with all the locational sort of elements of the REMA reform, even though it's not going to a zonal system, that there still needs to be locational considerations to that. I think our concern with a lot of this is that government are perhaps forgetting end users in a lot of these processes, and we want to ensure that industry are really brought into those discussions as much as possible and can kind of be quite central to those discussions, because I think the key to a lot of this is being able to deliver at a regional level and to be able to deliver sort of regional strategies beyond just a mass industrial strategy. And that relies on those connections being done well. I think one of the key benefits that we're hearing from manufacturers is a lot of them are interested in on-site renewables and to take that next step to kind of being self-sufficient, but they want opportunities to be able to sell that back into the system and being able to provide that flexibility within the system. And I think that's something that government's always struggled with is to find a price and to find an opportunity for flex and storage assets to be viable within the system that we've got. So I think that's the next challenge, and that really does depend on how these reforms are implemented. But yeah, as I say, I think the main thing is bringing industry into these discussions as much as possible, letting them have a role to play, and making sure that the results are customer centric and focused on delivering for them. And then in terms of funding, so I think the industrial strategy itself has been pretty vague on how they plan to fund the price reductions. I think there's mention of ETS revenues. Whether that will go far enough is a bit of an open question. I know that the Germans have done something fairly similar. They've got ETS revenues going into essentially a climate-based fund, which is making up for the revenue that's been lost from removing policy costs from industrial energy bills. It'll be interesting to see what sort of model the government employ. I think we would broadly say that general taxation is not a bad idea. It's probably quite a fair way of doing things, but obviously with HMT, that's quite a difficult argument to win. So, you know, we're open to having those discussions, but I think a lot of it depends on how the government's thinking about this and whether they think that ETS revenue can be viable enough and is able to be hypothecated in that way, which again is something that Treasury don't like talking about. So yeah, all to be seen, really.
Thanks, Patrick. Does anyone else want to come in on those points around financing or the accelerator service?
I'd love to come in on that. So I think in terms of the accelerator service, I sort of see it in two different buckets, really. Sort of, are there key strategic projects that you know have to happen or already planned? How do you sort of accommodate those holding bays, those sorts of things, and plan the network in the short term around that, and do you know, as early stage investment as you can, versus a more long-term enduring regime? And I think both of those are going to require input from the energy sector, but also it's a very political issue. So, you know, you could go to NESO and say, where shall I stick something? You have to tell me where it would be most optimal in terms of energy system operation. But obviously there's much wider environmental, social, economic impacts of these decisions that we need to take into account. So I think those need to be taken into account in both the terms of the strategic decisions and a more enduring regime as well. I think there's also a question over how much we're actually just doing central planning and saying generation, you go here, demand, you go here, versus market signals. And we're kind of moving to a mixture of the two on the generation side. How are we going to do that on the demand side? Because, you know, telling people where to go versus long-term contracts with the system operator, how you build that into network charging is more network market-based. So I think there's a question about both the role of sort of central planning versus markets, but also not just considering energy impacts, but wider societal impacts. And it's really interesting to see in the Netherlands where they've actually tried to do this prioritization process and develop a framework. And there, you know, the network operators are developing a rationale as to why they're prioritizing certain demand over others. So I think there's maybe something we can learn from the Netherlands. On the funding side, our paper did actually look at the sort of cost of full rebalancing. So if you were going to do it across the whole non-domestic sector, and we found a sort of shortfall in because you could put some cost onto gas, but then you'd have to mitigate that impact, for example, in the public sector, and it wouldn't give you enough to take all the levies off electricity. So we did a range of scenarios from 1.7 to 4 billion a year to take off legacy policy costs. So it's quite hard to know how much of that could come from ETS revenues, because we don't know what the carbon price is going to be. We have forecasts. We don't know what the scope of the emissions trading scheme is going to be. So you might have some sectors decarbonising, so therefore buying fewer allowances, but the scope of the scheme might change. But it did look sort of comparable. So I think there is definitely a need for taxation, particularly because you'd need that sort of hold in the budget in case the ETS revenues or the CBAM revenues didn't materialise. But we're not talking orders of magnitude out. And I just think, as I said in my opening remarks, that we're seeing other countries do this, like Germany, as Patrick said, but not just energy intensives, but also fuel poverty programs as well. And there's something about bringing people with us as we decarbonise.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. Right, let's get to a few of these in the Q&A in the chat then. I'm going to start with a question here from Rhys Finney, and I'm going to take another one as well that was directed to Michael at the same time. A little bit different, but I'll ask both of them together. First of all, from Rhys, the British industry competitiveness scheme is very promising for improving the business case for heat electrification in industry. But from what Rhys can see in the strategy, the eligibility of the scheme will be relatively limited. This seems like a missed opportunity. For example, food and beverage appears not to be eligible for the scheme, but this is a sector which has a higher heat demand than many foundational industries in the UK. And given the relatively low-grade heat requirements, has high TRL solutions, i.e. industrial heat pumps, readily available. Grid connection availability is clearly a challenge, but poor return on investment remains the biggest barrier. Should this and other manufacturing sectors not be supported? Rhys asked. That's the crux of Rhys's question there. And then one for yourself, Michael. It's around CCUS. Belinda Perryman asks, with the first CCUS cluster FIDs taken and with more anticipated, is increased electrification of energy-intensive industries in the pathways graph you shared consistent with the lower marginal costs of hooking into an operating CCS cluster? So two questions there around the competitive scheme, and then Michael, if you could address that one around CCS as well, if you have any thoughts on it.
Sure. Who do you want to go first, Tim?
Do you want to go first on that one then, and then we can
Okay.
think about the competitive scheme?
Well, maybe I'll start off with the CCS one, because it might be more likely that Patrick and Rachel want to follow up on the eligibility question. So yeah, on CCS, it is great. It's big news that we acknowledge in our progress report that financial investment decision has been reached on 2 clusters, and I think the government's given some limited development support to a third peak cluster since. So that's great. That they're obviously not just for industry. There's numerous uses of the CCS, but we do hope industrial firms will start plugging into those CCS networks. But they're still going to be relatively limited geographically, right? That's just 2 or 3, or maybe in the future there'll be 4 or 5, whatever. There'll still be lots of manufacturers that are not close to those clusters. So they will need some other solution other than CCS. And the point about the lower marginal cost, well, I think that really depends. Certainly overall in our modelling, and not just in our modelling, but talking to people, just as a general statement, electrification is probably the cheaper of the 2 if you ignore the subsidies. So if there are going to be subsidies, it would require less subsidy. I mean, I'm sure there are individual cases where that's not the case, and electrification isn't applicable to absolutely every industrial process, but just in general, we think electrification is cheaper. So I think there's room for both, but I certainly don't think that the advent of CCS contradicts our pathways in any way. I mean, we do have quite a bit of CCS in our pathways. Happy to hear any contrary views. On the eligibility, well, it's interesting that I agree that it would be a real shame if food and drink wasn't eligible for the competitiveness scheme, because I agree it's generally lower temperature processes and more suitable for, you know, solutions like electrification and heat pumps. When I read the industrial strategy, I wasn't so sure that food and beverage wouldn't be eligible. I mean, I think the number of 7,000 firms that Patrick mentioned came from the press release and not the strategy, which was interesting. But obviously, someone's had a go at assessing how many will be eligible. But the strategy just doesn't go into enough detail to really give you a good idea. And obviously, like, government could change its mind about whether food and beverage is eligible. So yeah, personally, I wouldn't be so sure that they're not, but I hope they are, and other kind of, you know, light manufacturers as well.
Thank you, Michael. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Just really quickly as well, I'm just going to throw another one into the mix that relates. So around the competitiveness scheme as well, Will Jones asks, the scheme unlocks future. He's interested to hear views on whether the new scheme unlocks future investment in electrification for those eligible, or are bigger discounts / more guaranteed discount durations needed to facilitate investment cases. So just a follow-up question there around investment to and whether the new scheme unlocks that. Any thoughts on that?
Should I go? So in terms of eligibility, yeah, I think in agreement with everything that's been said, I think we're keen to see that extended as much as possible to as broad a base of manufacturers as possible. In terms of the electrification question, I think the spark gap, as Michael mentioned, is probably still too big. There's probably more that can be done to encourage more electrification. And I think a lot of manufacturers are looking for certainty in terms of energy prices and what the kind of the next span looks like, and when the sort of right point is to make that transition. Whether energy prices is the main driver, or whether, you know, further funds for electrification could be another driver is I guess a question for government. But I think we'd want to see that spark gap much smaller than it is at the moment, and I think that's going to be the real driver to electrification.
Thanks, Patrick. Rachel, anything to add there before we move on?
No, I mean, I think the reduction in bills is sort of similar to the reduction we were sort of aiming at. We'd remove slightly different policy costs from the bill, and that does enable you to get to a sort of ratio that allows things with a very good coefficient of performance. So sort of space heating, where you can deploy a heat pump, you could see that sort of level of reduction getting some of those projects over the line. But I think obviously it depends on the company that's eligible, whether they had been planning to replace their space heating system or not. So you'd see a sort of hopefully a natural trickle through of the sector of eligible companies in those sectors starting to install some of those systems if they can get grid connection. So it'd be useful to kind of try and think about how the two can work together best, maybe to sort of prioritize network connection in eligible sectors, particularly in areas of the network which would benefit the system, either where there's already network capacity or there's excess renewables and things like that. So I think you can start to see some of that. I think, as Michael said, though, that some of the higher temperature, sorry, I won't say that because I know some high temperature processes are actually lower cost and vice versa. But in general, the more expensive processes, I think we really need to make progress on those and not just wait. And I think there's a bit of a risk of thinking, well, some of the legacy policy costs are going to come off in the 2030s. Well, we're adding new policy costs to the bill. So I think we don't want to assume that's going to be sufficient, and it's just a sort of hump we have to go over. I think Cornwall have done some projections on this, and we just need to be careful, as I said earlier, in our overall approach to putting levies on bills.
Thanks, Rachel. Really interesting there. Moving on then, because I'm conscious of time, there's a really interesting question here from John Barton. John asks, to what extent have the CCC and the government considered flexible demand. Big energy users, for example, steelworks, aluminium, ceramics manufacturers, cement, CCS processing and pumping, and of course, hydrogen production by electrolysis, being able to switch to electricity and to use that electricity mainly when solar and wind power outputs are high. This is key to reducing the price of electricity to industry use when it is cheaper. Any thoughts on that? And just a really quick addition to me, Patrick, you mentioned this as well. I'd be interested to hear the panel's thoughts on the importance of storage in this question as well. Hugely important, and I think more work needs to be done on this around long duration energy storage and hydrogen storage and that kind of thing. So question there around flexible demand, Michael, and anyone else who wants to come in and then question storage.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think it's a good point. Not enough is the answer to what extent of CCC considered flexible demand. We used a model. Our model couldn't take into account flexibility of electricity prices, so it was a gap. I dealt with that by having a box on it in the carbon budget report saying, look, this is important. An electrified industry could really help support the grid and bring down prices. I used the potential of industrial thermal batteries as an example technologies, but obviously there are many different processes that could provide flexible demand. I think it is a really important area. I don't think it's one we're going to study in more detail, but I am interested to hear from anyone who has the capability of doing a research project on it, and I'd love for the CCC to be involved.
Thanks, Michael. Patrick and Rachel, do you want to come in there on any of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a sort of introduction of thermal storage alongside electrification is the way that we're going to really unlock this. And I think already you can see some low temperature processes being able to be powered on a mixture of solar, private wire solar and thermal storage. So I think that's really promising, and that sort of could cover some of the markets, but obviously that's quite dependent on your site characteristics, the availability of land near you, and things like that. So it's also going to be really critical for grid connected electrified industry to be able to participate in flexibility services and markets. So we're continuing to see progress on opening up the markets to demand, but that needs to go even faster. And there's different ways in which procurement can help with that. So working with your energy supplier, if they can be aggregating some of those benefits and passing that on in through your tariff or your procurement arrangements. So we are starting to see that, but there are a number of barriers that our work is exploring on that. Things like final consumption levy being added to demand and things like that. So yeah, there's sort of tackling the markets, getting the right technology in, and getting people participating are the challenges there.
Thanks, Rachel. Just a couple more here I'm keen to get through before we wrap up. A really interesting question here from Andy Hume. Quite a politically charged one, but it's interesting nonetheless, and it's something that came up at our Net Zero Live conference as well. Andy says the political consensus around net zero appears to be breaking down. He says, see reform statements over the last 24 hours. Andy asks, is there a way of minimizing the risk to businesses and their investment decisions around this? I think one of the things that was mentioned at Net Zero was it's really important to communicate that there's the real kind of economic reasons for decarbonizing and the push towards net zero, not just the environmental reasons. Is that going to be key? Do you have any thoughts on that? And then just a really quick one from Richard Pyatt as well. He says, question to Rachel, you raised the two main challenges around price and connection. Would you agree that electrification challenges there's three of them, so price, connections, but also the often significant process changes and associated risks and internal resources, and of course capex on the demand side. Question on that. Also, he says, when could we expect more definition on the strategy ambiguity on foundational industries in the IS8, the industrial decarb strategy sees in a year's time? So some thoughts there. firstly on the political consensus and how important that is, and then some thoughts on those three challenges as well from yourself, Rachel. Michael, I don't suppose you want to start there.
Yeah, sure. I'll just talk to the political consensus one briefly. Yeah, it's very sad to see that political consensus, which I think the UK has been like a beacon on climate policy for many years, and one of the reasons has been the political consensus, but it is breaking down. That's true. And one of the areas that is breaking down around is about industry. So I'll confine my comments to industry. I mean, I know there's other contentious areas, but politicians who are against net zero are making hay out of industrial closures. So I think that just highlights how important it is that we start to show that industrial decarbonisation can be successful. I mean, let's face it, that these firms are closing down because of issues like energy prices, mostly detached from net zero, even without it. And net zero actually provides them, if industries can decarbonize and sell a lower carbon product, it actually provides a way through for them for competitiveness. But that needs to be demonstrated in practice. So it to me, it just adds to the urgency to have successful decarbonisation to counter the kind of messages we're hearing.
Patrick, any thoughts on that before I ask Rachel to address that second point?
I don't think there's anything beyond what Michael said. I think I completely agree. It's that I don't think we've done a good job, speaking about the country, in doing a good job of communicating what the actual benefits are to businesses. And I think they are understood within the industry, but not necessarily by the wider political consensus. And that there is so much advantage of being first mover in this space, being able to sell that technology on, being able to sort of innovate in this space is such a benefit, but it's hard to get that sort of cost benefit out into the public and communicate that well. And I think that's still a challenge we're facing.
Thanks, Patrick.
If it's
Rachel,
okay, I'll just very briefly touch on the first point as well, because I think it's such an important topic. I mean, I think the thing that strikes me when you look at the sort of jobs numbers is that you have to, as I said at the beginning, it's not just about the generation projects, it's about the supply chains to those projects. So it's all interlinked, because if we can't retain and increase some of the manufacturing capability to provide those projects, the jobs numbers aren't going to keep up. You need to show the jobs and actually have economic activity across the country to keep that sort of faith in the transformation. So I think it's, as I said, it's really important that not everything, and I think the offshore wind growth strategy looked at sort of where we might have an edge, where we might want to import stuff. They're going to be doing that for networks, onshore wind. That what should we be focusing in on here, and where should some of the investment in supply chain go to maximize that capability, I think is key. I think on the point about capex and process change, I think that's why, as I said, we were disappointed by the removal of the IETF, because I think you do need that sort of funding for feasibility, funding for expertise as to what the right option is. And maybe it wasn't the right thing, but we need something that replaces that, so that people can actually get advice on what they need to install, particularly for SMEs. So we were saying things like, although it's lower temperature, there's the Business Energy Scotland scheme that provides really detailed technical advice to businesses on what they need to actually do to cut carbon and bills. I think you're going to need something like that. And I think if we get a targeted electrification support in the future, that's a big question. Does it sponsor capex or opex or a mixture of both? Getting that right would be really critical, and something that the Innovation Fund is kind of looking at. Yeah, you can't make assumptions on and you've got to have something that works for all different types of businesses.
Excellent. Thank you, Rachel. Brilliant. I think that's just about it for questions. I suppose just a last one from me to finish then before we close the session today. We have a 10-year strategy now, and a clear kind of direction forward. I think that's something that's been missing. I think that's fair to say. And it kind of knits a lot of these policy developments we've seen together. Obviously, lots more to do. It's just a starting point. Just a really quick word from our three speakers then about what you think the key immediate next steps are now, for kind of our foundational sectors for our industries in order to provide, I suppose, support and confidence and basically what you think we need to do now immediately to really capitalize on this new strategy and sense of direction. Rachel, do you want to go first on that?
Yeah, so I think there's some really promising initiatives in industrial strategy. So things like you know, schemes to shore up the demand curve for OEMs and things like that. So kind of making progress on some of the new initiatives in the industrial strategy and actually working them up with industry and trying to implement them, I suppose is the first thing. I think the second is actually getting this consultation out on which sectors are going to get this policy cost support. And then finally, I suppose we're really pleased to see linkage on both ETS and consideration of re-entry into the internal energy market. So making sure that we get that in place as quickly as possible. The Commission have come out with their mandate this week. So, let's keep the momentum behind all of those efforts to minimise distortions between markets.
Thanks, Rachel. Well said. I think that goes to a few of the points that were raised today around eligibility, and that a bit of clarity on that I think is very important at this stage. Michael, any final thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm just going to say one thing, which is just to reiterate the need for some kind of business model, financial support. We don't have a strong opinion on what it should be, but something that enables manufacturers to electrify and is provided to them on the basis that they will electrify.
Thanks, Michael. Brilliant. Patrick, final word to you then.
Yeah, similar to what everyone else has said, I think it's all about now getting some clarity with how everything's going to be implemented, making sure that industry is brought into everything as much as possible. So making sure that comms is really clear, making sure there's a really collaborative atmosphere going on. And I think, as Rachel said, get this consultation out as soon as possible because we want to start engaging with getting lower energy costs into the system and want to start engaging with that as soon as possible. And also, if there could be a successor to the IETF, I think that would be well received across the industry.
Thanks, Patrick. Really important point there. That's come through throughout the entire session today. Brilliant. Well, I think that's a good place to finish then. Thank you very much indeed, Patrick, Michael, and Rachel for joining us and sharing your thoughts. Really interesting discussion. Thanks to all of you as well for joining us as attendees and asking those really good questions. I think there's a strong consensus now around what's needed in order to make this a success. So thank you very much for joining. Just really quickly to finish, as I mentioned, this session today is part of the Foresight webinar series. We're going to be, this was our inaugural session. We thought it would be good to start with the industrial strategy, seeing as it's so live and it's a really good strategic time to take stock of this. But we're going to be looking at quite a few topics across the energy transition landscape. So our next session is on CCUS funding and development and what's next for those projects. That's taking place in a couple of weeks' time. We're looking at sustainable finance. We're going to be looking at natural hydrogen as well. We're going to be looking across the entire market and sector. And this webinar series is a feed into the Foresight event, which is our big all-energy clean tech show that's taking place next February, the 4th and 5th of February. That's going to be looking at all of the energy markets, and kind of what we're trying to do is create a bit of a shared vision and a chance for all of these different sectors to come together to discuss what's next for the UK's energy transition, to make the UK I've heard the term clean energy superpower quite a lot. So what's needed in order to facilitate that transition? We'd love to have you there in February, but for now, thank you very much again for joining us for this webinar. Please do take an eye on the Foresight webinar series, and if any are of interest, please do feel free to join us. But for now, I think that's a good place to finish. Thanks again to all of our speakers, and thank you for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you again in the future. So all the best and take care. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks all.